Welcome to all of you. I'm looking at the screen this afternoon, seeing a lot of my dear friends here at Monte Vista Groves Homes, as well as people from the community. So we're thrilled to have you here this afternoon for what is our penultimate convocation for the fall semester. We're going to finish it out next week with some celebration of Christmas with music, and we'll be doing the Zoom and broadcast from the sanctuary at San Marino Community Church. So we look forward to having you for that. And this afternoon, I want to introduce you to two friends of mine, Boris Borisov and Mark Finney. Mark is dropping off his daughter right now at ballet lessons, and he'll be joining us in just a moment. But this is a discussion about a story that I was pulled into when I arrived in Spokane in 1994. And the story of how God leads the church in a particular community, not over 1 or 2 years or events, but over a long period of time. And so I'm thrilled that you're going to have a chance to meet Mark and Boris, and they're going to do the talking this afternoon. I will guide it with some questions that I want to prompt and want you to have a chance to hear from them. And then we'll leave some time for Q&A next week. So glad to have you all on board. And since we're thinking about taking a view of what God does over time, I thought a scripture that we should listen to is one of a multitude of passages in the Bible that focus us on the importance of remembering. So our text for today is 1 Chronicles 16, verses 11 to 15. And this kind of a passage you can find throughout the Old Testament. The story of Israel's past, it really becomes the anchor for how they understand themselves as a people. So hear now the word of the Lord. Seek the Lord and God's strength. Seek God's presence continually. Remember the wonderful works God has done, God's miracles and the judgments that God uttered. O offspring of Israel, children of Jacob, God's chosen ones. God is the Lord our God. God's judgments, or the other translation of that would be God's justice, is in all the earth. Remember God's covenant forever, the word that he commanded for 1,000 generations. Let us pray. Gracious God, we know that each of our lives is woven into the big story of your work in creation and in redemption and in consummation, in setting the world, as N.T. Wright says, in setting the world to rights from the brokenness that we have perpetrated upon ourselves. And so today we focus on one part of that big story, the surprising work that you've been doing over several decades in Spokane, a work that has drawn Boris and Mark's lives together in some remarkable ways as they seek to be agents of your good news, Jesus' truth, Jesus' grace, Jesus' love, Jesus' mercy, in Spokane right now, with literally hundreds and hundreds of people. So help us to listen well to this story and to link it to the particularities of our lives. You are a God of grace, such abundant grace, and we give you thanks in Christ's name. Amen. Well, Boris Borisov is the pastor at Pacific Keep Church in Spokane, and Mark Finney is the director of Thrive International. That's their current work. but there are backstories that I want you to be able to learn a little bit from. So I've prompted them with some questions along the way. We'll continue this conversation for about 45 minutes, then we'll leave time for a question and answer. So Boris, you were part of that initial wave of Slavic peoples that came to Spokane after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. So you came, school in Spokane, university in Spokane, city planner, and then transitioning to your full-time work now in Pacific Heap. So just give us a few of the details of your life and how you've ended up in your current position.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you very much for having me. I hope you guys can hear me okay. Terry, can you hear me?
Yep, we're good.
That means everybody can hear me. So yeah, my name is Boris Borisov, and I immigrated to the US in 92, right after the fall of the Soviet Union, or shortly thereafter. I came through a humanitarian, actually a religious refugee status. And at that time, right after the fall of the Soviet Union, right before like 91, 90, people were traveling to America, but there was no connection. There was no direct route. And so people would actually get a visa to travel to Israel, like either a resident visa, get to Italy or Europe on their way to Israel, go to the American consulate and redo their paperwork to come into the US. And so the Israelis got wind of this and they were not very happy. And long story short, there was a big meeting, a summit between the president at that time, I think it was George H.W. Bush, and Gorbachev, and they figured out a way to open up a direct path to America after some high profile events where a few Slavic people stormed the U.S. embassy and demanded change. And so long story short, I'm in Spokane because of that, all of that type of work. Landed in Spokane. One of the folks who actually stormed the U.S., or not the U.S., excuse me, the consulate in Russia back then, ended up moving to Spokane. And then the president in 92 on his way through Spokane, because he was doing campaigning, had dinner with this lady. And there's a great spokesman article about how they had dinner in Spokane. So anyway, long story short, I'm in Spokane because of other people's advocacy, hard work. And, I grew up, I never really thought too much about my old country because I grew up in Spokane, went to church here, grew up here, but I went to a Slavic church. So Russian speaking in the house, and also Russian speaking, Ukrainian speaking in my congregation growing up for 20 years or so. But my life was, I'm an American first, right? I grew up here. And then during my schooling, I ended up pursuing city planning. Was really passionate about business development and district development and making sure our city works at a high level, and did that for a long time, for 12 years after graduating from university. And during that time, our church, which was Slavic speaking, Russian-Ukrainian, we realized that as the youth was growing up, they were leaving the church because everything was still done in Russian. And so at that time, I was a volunteer youth group leader. And we decided to start doing services in English. And one thing led to another. That youth group kind of grew to essentially what became a separate church. And our leadership at our church said, hey, look, if we're going to integrate into Spokane and American society, we have to have a church that speaks English as their primary language. So our Slavic youth could invite friends and do evangelism and be on mission and all of that. And so anyway, long story short, as I was working as a city planner full time, we also planted a church, and I ended up in Whitworth's Master's of Theology program, where I met Terry, our wonderful host, who taught me how to read the Bible correctly. So thank you, Terry. And so long story short, I was bivocational, working full time at the city and doing this church plant. And then it grew, and I left the city and did the work at Pacific Heap Church, which was a mixture of second-gen Slavics like myself, first-gen, and also American Spokaneites. We were kind of a mix of folks. And so that's kind of the quick, 3-minute summary of my 30-year journey. And then I'm sure we'll get a little later into the story of how we ended up serving the current Ukrainian population. So did I miss anything, Terry?
And Mark, you also grew up in the area, native of Coeur d'Alene, which has its own unique socio-demographic and political feel to it. And Whitworth alum, and you and I worked in ministry together. Eventually you made your way here to Fuller in Pasadena, M.Div and Ph.D, and then went back to Spokane to plant a church, right? And but God had other things in mind. So give us a little bit of your background.
Yeah, so I'll just say greetings to those of you down in Southern California. Hopefully it's warm down there. We're getting snowed on right now in Spokane. So yeah, enjoy that. I missed my 9 years down there. It was pretty great. I loved living down there. And I don't know if you remember me, but I recognize Ron White. I've had a chance to meet you once or twice. So good to see you again. But yeah, basically I grew up in very rural northern Idaho. My family lived on a farm and managed, my dad was a logger, so I just didn't have a lot of cross-cultural experience. It was mostly just rural white folk. But I did get a chance to meet Terry when I went to Whitworth as an undergraduate student, and that was part of my sense of calling into something bigger. So did an M.Div and eventually a Ph.D. in theology. I have a heart for the church and feel called to ministry. And it's never worked out really well for me to do full-time ministry exclusively. And so even now I'm still pastoring a church, but it's sort of evenings and weekends part-time. And but I moved back up here from Fuller in 2015 to do church planting. And some things changed while we got here, specifically some of the denominational structures that I was working within had some leadership changes. And so after about 4 or 5 months on the church planting journey, I ended up having to find another job to support my family. And it turned out that the job that would have me was doing refugee resettlement with a nonprofit here called World Relief. It's part of a national network that does refugee resettlement. So starting in the summer of 2016, I started working with refugees, and through a long series of events that I'll spare you, ended up becoming the director of that office and then leaving about a year ago, a little less than a year ago, to start something new. And it's, I don't know, how far do you want me to go, Terry? Or
that's okay. That's good, Mark. We'll pick up on the current situation, which will form the block of our conversation after I throw out this next question to you. So, so Spokane is pretty isolated geographically. It's the largest city between Seattle and Minneapolis on the I-90 freeway, and yet it has become known throughout the nation as a place that really welcomes refugees. It's one of the very important places of work for World Relief, Mark, that you were a part of for so many years. So fill us in a little bit, both of you, from your perspectives of that part of the story. First, this wave of Slavic immigration, Boris, that you mentioned in the early 90s, but, World Relief's office emerged during the 90s as well. And then as refugee crisis grew worldwide because of all the upheaval in the world, wars, internal, external, 9/11, Iraq, Afghanistan. Give us a sense from your perspectives on what has happened in Spokane as all of these different groups of people have come into the community over now, close to 30 years. You guys have seen it and you've lived it and you've participated in it.
Yeah, Mark, you want me to go first, or do you want to talk about? Okay, so I think from my perspective, because I came as the Slavic group in the 90s, and I actually talked to the director of World Relief back then, who was responsible for basically opening the office in Spokane. I did an undergraduate thesis on why Slavics chose Spokane, and there are three major reasons. Number one was the weather was similar, of all things, right? 4 seasons. People love snow from Slavic countries. Two was affordable housing. It was really cheap and affordable to come and live here in the 90s. But then the third huge reason was the establishment of the church because a bunch of religious refugees came here and they established 1, 2, 3 churches. Now we have 25 Slavic churches in Spokane and counting. As soon as that happened, it became the hub. And World Relief initially was resettling people to other smaller cities around Spokane, like Walla Walla, Eastern Washington, Pullman, and then they second migrated to Spokane. And I think what is most important for refugees is when they come to a community, if the community is open with regards to jobs and housing and all of these opportunities, and Spokane was at that time, people were incredibly generous. They come in. And so Spokane really welcomed people. Spokane gave people the opportunity to live affordably, to go to school. The school systems themselves were really great towards the refugees. I remember going to school and we would have, tutors and people coming in to help us transition from a language perspective. My parents went to the Spokane Community College. They were offered free English as a second language class. Healthcare, Spokane stepped up. The county health district helped us a lot back then. I remember my mom told me that we had, free healthcare for a good period of like 6 months while they were getting established and on their feet. So Spokane was a welcoming community, and they gave the refugees a good on-ramp to the freeway, if you will, to kind of get their life in order. And so that was, I think, it was twofold. One was the community helped itself by organizing a church where people felt like they belonged. But two, the community surrounded them and helped them get on their feet. And I think that sort of combination of both the host community offering services and then the refugee community organizing itself well provided sort of that spark and catalyst for why Spokane was so great.
And Mark, you have seen this from the perspective of World Relief, beyond just the Slavic communities, people coming from literally all over the world. And you've lived that story. Hey, Mark, your background screen is kind of flickering in and out. I don't know if you see that.
I'm sorry for. I'm not. I wasn't able to be in my office today because I had to pinch hit for dropping my kids off. So I'm still trying to figure out how to get the lighting right. But anyway, appreciate your grace to bear with me on that.
Not a problem. That's better.
So World Relief's office started in Spokane in 92. 89 in an outlying community, and ended up here in 92. And so over the last 30 years that World Relief's office operated here, something like 50 nationalities had come through that particular refugee office. And so as I served there as the executive director for the past 5 years up until this year. And one of the things that I saw that made the work go so well is the dynamics in the community are really supportive, not in the political sense, because the issue of refugees has become very politicized. And this is not the most consistently progressive political part of the country. It's actually fairly conservative, but it has a little bit more of a small town feel, even though it's a mid-sized city with about 500,000 in the kind of metro area. There is a sense of community here and a sense of kind of caring for your neighbor. And the churches are really a key part of that. One of the pieces that I credit the cooperation with is that a lot of the churches work well together. A couple of our biggest churches include some Presbyterian, sort of old, downtown First Church, mainline churches, but also some kind of like big Foursquare and independent Bible churches who differ a lot on theology and church polity, but have found ways to work together really well within the city, especially on causes of justice and causes of humanitarian support. So that's been really, really cool to be a part of in this city. And I think part of the reason that when newcomers arrive here, they feel a sense of connection and welcome. Now, more specifically with the churches, World Relief and now the new organization I lead here called Thrive International, we're really intentional to partner with faith communities and to recruit volunteers and to give churches and others opportunities to kind of be the first folks that new refugees engage with. And, for new populations, that arrive, that's really helpful if they don't have a lot of folks from their own ethnic group to engage with. And then once a lot of those groups get established, like the Slavic community, they form their own faith communities, and that becomes a key sort of welcoming community as well for people. So that's a couple of things that I've noticed that I think are really special about what's allowed us to welcome so many folks here in Spokane.
And while I want to focus this conversation on the Slavic community, Mark, particularly as a result of 9/11 and then the tragic wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as conflict in Sudan, you've seen populations of people literally from all over the world coming. So say a little bit about your observations of basically the world becoming expressed right there in Spokane.
Right. Yeah. So for a small inland community, I mean, we're 300 miles from the coast. We're not a big multicultural hub like a Seattle or a Portland or an LA. We're just a kind of a small middle America kind of place. But especially with the hospitality offered to refugees, we've seen a significant shift in our demographic, not in huge numbers, but in the diversity of the folks who are here. And that's been really, really amazing because as the church in America is shifting away from an international focus, churches are shrinking, missions budgets are shrinking. There's not as many people being sent overseas to do traditional mission work or even business as mission types of initiatives. What we're finding is that folks from some of the most remote, distant, or hard to reach parts of the world are living right down the street from folks here in a sleepy little, mostly white American small city. That's amazing. I think especially as we've looked at one example would be Afghanistan. You couldn't send a missionary to Afghanistan, no matter how passionate you were, and expect anything successful to come of that. But we had 500 people from Afghanistan move into our community in just the last 12 months. That's an incredible opportunity for mission, for connecting with people who don't know the Jesus story or maybe know of Jesus, but have never had a relationship with Christians and had the opportunity to really explore and understand what the Christian gospel is. And that's pretty exciting. We've also seen some churches really embrace that and lean in. What I've found and what I believe both theologically and practically works best is just genuine relationship. Genuine, engage, share your faith in a way that's accessible, and be equally as excited to share about your own faith as you are to learn about theirs. And in the context of relationship, kind of that marketplace of ideas or marketplace of theology, there's a genuine opportunity for folks to explore new things and to share new experiences and to visit church that they've never been to before, but also invite you to go visit the mosque that they have. Those are really neat experiences and things that I've seen transform not just the immigrants who are here, but breathe new life into some of our congregations in this community too, in ways that are really exciting.
Thanks, Mark. One of the things over the years we've gotten pulled into in Spokane is the immigration table and the National Immigration Forum. A discussion on nations have Church of Christian faith in this conversation. The second B is badges. They want people who are involved in law enforcement and how they see the significance of immigration reform in terms of keeping our communities safe. And the third B is business, economic development in communities as a result of the significant presence of groups of refugees. Boris first, and then Mark second. Say a little bit about the contributions that groups of immigrants to Spokane have made on the local business community. Boris, you'd have a great sense of this because of your work as a city planner, and Mark, then you interact with so many employers. So what's going on in business in relationship to immigrants settling in Spokane?
Yeah, I think I heard all of you. You were cutting out a little bit, so hopefully you guys can hear me okay. Yes?
Yeah,
Okay.
we're fine.
So yeah, I worked as an economic development planner, and I know that in Spokane, we have this big disparity between the jobs that are needed to be filled and people who are working. So, when I was sitting on the mayor's economic development council for a few years, we looked at one of the biggest crises in Spokane was if we doubled our construction workforce magically, we still wouldn't have enough construction people to meet the demand of the growing housing market. There's a housing shortage, and so sort of those classic jobs that people need to do, like framing and carpentry and welding and repair shops and things like that. And we've seen, at least from the Slavic perspective, a lot of the people who came. Now we have about 50,000 Slavics in Spokane since the immigration started in the 90s, which is actually 10% of the population in the county. And what was really beneficial, and I know this personally because my dad told me this story, was in Ukraine and Russia and the former Soviet states, it was very difficult to run your own business because the government wouldn't allow it, or they would have to really cheat, and you'd have to find ways because you couldn't make money. Everything was government owned. And so one of the coolest things about Spokane is people were able to start their own businesses, and they still had to go and pay taxes and all of that. But they actually saw, hey, if I work, I can actually see a result from that benefit. And so a lot of our Slavic people in Spokane, I don't know exactly the percentage, but a good majority are probably in the trades. And a lot of those have started their own companies around framing and cabinetry. And, like one of my best friends owns one of the largest granite and cabinet stores in Spokane. So the first generation had these small mom and pop businesses. The second generation, now they've been here for a while, they're opening up like stores where they're wholesaling stuff. And so it's huge for the needs of our city. The Slavic folks are running a lot of construction businesses and a lot of like logistics businesses like trucking. Those seem to be the two areas where they contribute. And so I think it's pretty invaluable here's a good example. I'm jumping ahead right now a little bit, Terry, but the recent about 2,500 Ukrainian refugees that arrived in Spokane since the start of the war, many of those folks were able to, once they get work authorization, go to some of these first-gen Slavics who've been here for a while and get a job. Most of them are seeking employment. And because their employers are Slavic, first-gen Slavic immigrants, they have the cultural background and they even speak the language. So it's actually helped the current wave contribute to the local economy. So,
right. Thank you. Mark, are you there? Or there's Mark. So Mark, from your perspective, the contribution of immigrants and refugees in terms of business and local economy.
Yeah, so some of the national statistics are really helpful to look at in this one. One of them that I find myself sharing a lot with people is that sort of the per capita rate of starting new businesses is twice what it is among refugees. It's twice what it is among sort of folks born here. There is something about the immigration process, I think, that sort of self-selects people who are risk takers, who have vision, who are willing to try new things. And you end up with folks who, have the courage to cross an ocean in a rubber raft for their own safety or to create a new vision for their kids. They're much less intimidated by the process of trying to figure out how to get a business permit and start a restaurant than maybe your average person who's born here. So we see a lot of businesses here locally as well as nationally that are the fruit of refugee innovation. Actually, I read somewhere that, I can't remember the exact source, but I read that 40% of the Fortune 500 companies have been started by immigrants or the children of immigrants in this country. And that includes one of the founders of Google, a guy named Sergey Brin, who came here as a kid as a refugee and ended up starting one of the biggest, most influential tech companies in the world. So that's not a coincidence that there's some characteristics there that I think are important to note. So locally, we see that also in folks starting important businesses, including in businesses in areas where sort of the American-born population is maybe not as interested in operating in. Boris mentioned the trades. That's one of the huge challenges as we face a housing crisis in this area, is that a lot of the folks who've traditionally done trade work, plumbing, electrical, heating, ventilation, a lot of those folks are people in their 50s and 60s who are sort of aging out of that work. And as a growing emphasis on college education has grown in the last couple of decades, there's not nearly as many people going into that work. So refugees and other immigrants are really important to sort of replenish some of those key sectors in our workforce. And another piece of demographic data, immigrants, including refugees, tend to immigrate here in age groups that are younger than our most of our American bell curve. So the bell curve of the American population is somewhere between ages 40 and 55. But the average age of an immigrant or a refugee is usually somewhere in their 20s. And that includes a lot of kids, but also a lot of people in their late 20s, early 30s, who have energy and time and the most productive years of their lives still in front of them. That's really important for replenishing our workforce and for filling in a lot of those areas where folks are struggling to find employees. So just a real basic example, once we got in the newspaper for this shelter that we're running, this transitional housing shelter, some of the first phone calls we started to get as the news rolled out across our community were from employers who called us up and said, hey, we would love for you to send some people over and work in our hotel because we don't have enough housekeepers. Hey, could you send some folks over into our manufacturing facility because we do not have enough people to run our assembly lines. Hey, there's this new Amazon factory, distribution center out by the airport. We need hundreds more people to staff this thing. Is there any way you could send some of your people to work here? So we find that the employers are reaching out to us because this is a group that can replenish part of what's missing in our labor force right now.
Yeah. Well, let's fast forward to the present. So, Boris, you told us earlier that one of the reasons for the initial wave of Slavic peoples was because of affordable housing. And we all know what happened to the price of housing because of the COVID crisis. And we saw this coming in Spokane even prior to COVID. So what once was very accessible and affordable became scarce and very expensive. And Mark, I know that was one of the primary drivers that led you to leave World Relief and start Thrive, was because World Relief does not get directly involved in owning or managing housing. So Mark, you step away from World Relief early 2022, February 24th, the Russians invade Ukraine. And now there is this wave of people leaving, your home country, Boris, fleeing the chaos of the war, many of them coming to the United States. And so the two of you then start to work together on what can happen in Spokane, and then the surprising, amazing story of how the hotel became available. So the two of you fill us in on, February till now in terms of what's happened.
Okay. Yeah. I'll start a little bit and I'll let Mark fill in because we've been joined at the hip since that time. On February 24th, the war broke out. We have 50,000 Slavic people. So obviously a lot of people know people in Ukraine. And that same weekend, we convened all the Slavic pastors and leaders of Spokane for like an emergency prayer session. And from that, we issued a statement to our American friends in Spokane saying, this is how you can pray specifically for our country and the people that are grieving right now in Spokane. And out of that meeting, we formed a subcommittee, which then we later called the Ukrainian or the Ukraine Relief Coalition. It was an informal coalition of churches, businesses, and Slavic leaders. And we met every single week and we had three goals. Goal one was to pray and to send money to Ukrainian churches that we had connections with on the ground who were experiencing death, bombardment, just persecution, like lots of bombs landing, churches being blown up, things like that. So supporting those folks we knew. Number two, we wanted to educate and provide timely info for people in Spokane who were asking questions every day. So we organized some rallies and some protests and some just show of support. And then three, we actually heard like 6 weeks into this meeting with the URC, the Ukraine Relief Coalition, that there were Slavic Ukrainian people showing up in the Mexican border and getting inside of the US, because right after that, when I think Biden said we'd admit some folks, I don't have all my timelines straight, but people just started flying to Mexico and claiming asylum or claiming, some sort of status, and they were let in on humanitarian parole. So long story short is we had this leader group that we're meeting weekly. And then in April, we started hearing through this group, we established a couple of like text chats through some apps. We started seeing hundreds of Ukrainians showing up into Spokane. And they were living in people's basements, churches, friends' homes, things like that. They didn't really have much of anything. They didn't have dollars tied to them like you would through regular channels of immigration. And so right around that time, Mark and I, and Mark, I'll let you fill in a little bit too, we were already working together, mostly because we were in a pastor's reading group, and we were supposed to go to New York together for this conference. And we both, Mark and I, had a contact in Washington Department of Commerce, and the Commerce fiscal year was running out in June of that year. And this person called Mark and then emailed me saying, look, the Commerce Department has some surplus funding, about $3 million for the whole state, and we want to make those funds available to help arriving Ukrainians in our communities. And so Mark and I joined forces, him with Thrive and me leading the Ukraine Relief Coalition. And I think it was on our flight to New York, we put together a proposal of how we could serve the hundreds of refugees here. And from that grant application, we were able to directly provide financial assistance to hundreds of families, but also use some of that funding to secure this empty, vacant hotel that was sitting for 2 years unused and turn it into temporary housing for these refugees. And I'll let Mark talk a little bit about those details and how that hotel package came together.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride, because against that backdrop, I left my previous job and was working off of an iPad in my daughter's bedroom on a folding table, like, start a nonprofit by yourself. And so my game plan was, hopefully by the end of this year, that I'd have raised enough money that I could hire a couple of people to start doing some things related to building apartment buildings for refugees and doing some youth programs and some women's programs. But the crisis in Ukraine catalyzed just an enormous wave of folks coming here. Just for some context, Spokane usually welcomes about 400, maybe 500 refugees a year through the traditional refugee resettlement pipeline, like through World Relief. We had 500 people that came to Spokane in April by themselves as Ukrainian refugees, with no social supports, nothing. And so in a month, we got about as many people as the city was used to dealing with in a year, but with no social support services, no case management, no additional funding, just really an extreme version of what we had been used to seeing before. And I've got this little nonprofit, which is little more than a name. So when we started dreaming about this 100,000 square foot hotel with 150 rooms in it, it was just really straight up crazy. But Boris and I sat down, we made a plan. We said, we think we can ask the state for $1 million, and we think we can spend it in 6 weeks. So we sent them our application. They said yes to it. And all of a sudden we had a bunch of money, and we had to figure out what to do with it. So we were able to secure a master lease on this Quality Inn in downtown, former Quality Inn, because of it was still in pretty decent condition. It still even had like the soap in the bathroom and the little Quality Inn sealed containers. And so we got the keys to the place June 6th. And on June 7th, we started moving people in. And by July 1st, I think we were at full occupancy. in the hotel. So it's felt like building a plane while you're flying it. Things have started to feel a little bit more normal the last month or two, but it's been quite a journey. And the thing that I always tell people, because folks say like, how in the world did you do this? And I say, really, I was able to contribute kind of a narrow set of skills. Like I have a background in refugee resettlement, so I know social services, and I understand like how to work with the state on state contracts. But really the thing about this that I am most proud of and excited about is that really this is the Slavic community's own doing. Because of folks like Boris and other pastors who've been here a long time, they have the networks within their own community that they were able to track. When folks arrived, they all had this big sort of impromptu spreadsheet they created. And when they heard that one family came, they put them on the spreadsheet, and somebody from another church told them to somebody else. And so when we started talking about housing, and I reached out to the owner of the hotel and we started talking to the state, I said, Boris, if I sign a master lease on a 150 room hotel, and at the end of this month, there's only 12 people living in there, I'm going to look like the biggest fool on the face of the earth. But I said, is there any way you can give me some hard numbers on, we've heard people want this, but can you give me some hard data on this? He's like, oh yeah, we know all the people. We have a communication thread through this app called Viber. We'll just make a little survey and send it out. Well, 48 hours later, they give me a list of 80 families who have said, I will move into that hotel if you get it. That's a testimony to the kind of organization and networking that exists within all these churches here in town. So I feel like I've been part of this thing, but really it's been the Slavic community themselves that's pulled together. There's much more that could be told, but one other example of that is that as the Ukrainians were showing up in Mexico, a bunch of churches in Spokane, Sacramento, all over the country who had friends and family that were telling them about, hey, I'm getting a ticket to Mexico. I'm going to try and cross the border and, get stamped for humanitarian parole by CBP. These guys said, well, we better go down and help them navigate things and give them food and meet them at the border. So these churches like overnight started flying volunteers down to Tijuana, had this whole system set up on both sides of the border where they were taking care of the Slavic folks. It was amazing. Like it was really, really amazing. And it was really organic how it grew out of this immigrant community. So one of the pieces that I love as somebody who's not a refugee, my ancestors came from Sweden about 4 generations ago. I think it's amazing to see that fruit, the sort of full circle of, yeah, we say that we want to help vulnerable people and we should, and as Christian people, there should be compassion. But I think the greatest source of innovation, creativity that we have right now in this community to solve this refugee crisis is the folks who came a generation ago in the last refugee crisis. They have the skills, the innovation, the language abilities, the cultural understanding, and the will to step up and make a huge difference in a very pressing challenge. So I think it's beautiful. And I also am excited, like, I don't know what's going to happen 20 or 30 years from now, but wouldn't it be neat if the folks that are living in this hotel with us right now and learning English from our church volunteers, in another 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years, who are they going to be the ones to welcome? What innovations are they going to create? So I'm excited to be a part of this thing. And I'm really proud that I get to stand alongside folks like Boris and the rest of the Slavic community in this area and see God doing some amazing, amazing things.
Well, just one more question. So fast forward now from February and June to early December. There's been transition in the hotel. People who've come in have moved out. Others are coming in. It's kind of a second wave or a second generation coming into the Thrive International Hotel. Tell us a little bit about what's happened between June and now. Boris?
Yeah, so I'll start real quick and then Boris, you can add on to it. There's not a lot of other facilities like this that are really like a transitional housing specifically for refugees. So at first we weren't sure exactly how well it would work. Would people want to really move in? Once they moved in, would they ever be willing to move out? But it's actually worked really well. Our goal was to have people here from 3 to 6 months, give them enough time to get their social security numbers and learn a little English and get a job, and then they be independent. And we've actually seen more than 200 people who've transitioned through, who lived with us at one point but are out on their own, which is really, really encouraging. So we're seeing that what we had hoped would happen really is that if you give people a little bit of time to catch their breath and get their bearings and some support, that they really do become independent. So that's been really neat. And maybe Boris can speak to this more, but when we started this, we didn't know how long it would last, right? Like we got this thing in June. We were all hoping like, well, maybe one way or another, this war is going to kind of be winding down by the end of the summer. And increasingly, it looks like this is a protracted situation. There's now a more formal system for Ukrainians to come here through family sponsorship called Uniting for Ukraine. And there's 70,000 Ukrainians have come to the country just since April. And there's another 100,000 applications that are in various stages of approval. So we're expecting that there's as many Ukrainians as have arrived. We're going to see even larger numbers coming in the next year. So we're trying to sort of retool from the sprint into the marathon.
Yeah, and I'll just add, what's happening is they're trying to integrate. The big question, of course, is their status. After 2 years of the temporary status, what will happen? So we're working with attorneys to try to get a permanent pathway to status and staying here. But I'll just share one story because I think story is really important here. The church I pastor, we're in between buildings. So we said, hey, while we're waiting for this other building I'm in right now to rehab, why don't we just move our church services to the hotel since we have it? And we'll just invite people from the hotel. And the first Sunday we did that, I didn't know how many Ukrainians would show up, but I get up to preach and there are more Ukrainians from the hotel than our own people. So I immediately on the spot preached the sermon in English, a paragraph in English, and translated myself into Russian. And people just kept coming back and people kept coming back. And our church exploded with refugees, Christians who believe in Jesus. And now I have a church full of church planters, pastors, deacons, and worship leaders whose churches have been burned out, who are part of my church now. And one Sunday, I think it was week 4, I saw these 2 Americans walk in, an older gentleman and his son, and they're sitting there through service. And I thought, oh, great. They just showed up because they heard about the Thrive Center. And after service, they're hugging it out with all these Ukrainians that are living in the hotel and crying. And I'm thinking, boy, I really preached a great sermon. Everybody's like, Lord. Well, it turns out that these 2 Americans just moved to Spokane a couple years ago from Texas. Before moving here from Texas, they had spent 25 years as missionaries in Ukraine. They traveled to every single metropolitan area and lived in hosts' homes and taught a 7-course thing on leadership and the Bible and how to live life. And then they stopped that work in 2019 because the government closed it, or something happened where they had to shut it down. And they had just happened to move to Spokane a couple of years ago, heard about the work at Thrive through the Spokesman Review, the newspaper, and decided to come check out this hotel and church service because the newspaper article talked about how we moved our services there. They walk into the service and they run into about 10 people who were their hosts in Ukraine many years ago that they did missionary work with in Ukraine. That's why they were all crying and hugging it out, right? Now, get this gentleman and his father, of course, the great story, they invite me to their house for tea. A couple of weeks later, I go to their house. They have this giant map of Ukraine and it's penciled like where all the places they traveled. And I look, and they had been in my home city where I was born in Nikolaev, which is completely bombed out from the Russian invasion. And after I had lunch with them, they said, we have a gift for you. And they gave me this wooden carved seal. It was the seal of my home city that was gifted to them by the church pastors after they had done their training in my home city of Nikolaev. And they said, we want you to have this as a gift. This is what your pastors in the city you were born in gave us as a gift. We want to pass this on to you. I burst in. I mean, I was a mess, right? I mean, talk about a 30-year full circle. And I had been in my home city in 2012. I went back to bury my grandfather, and I had met some of those church pastors who were then trained by these random folks showing up to the church service at the Thrive Center in 2022. That's just one story. I could tell you stories for 3 more hours of what providentially God's been doing in terms of like the connections through the hotel, our church, this background story, and all of the pieces are being weaved together. And at the end of January, we're holding a baptism. 4 people are getting baptized who have come to Jesus in faith, who have escaped war, who found our church through the hotel, who said, God has shown up in such great ways that we want to serve Jesus now. So, to me, it's just, I know that this is what I was born for. Like, this moment in my life is where God has brought us. So it's been pretty incredible.
Well, I think you can see in what we've heard from Boris and Mark why I was so excited to introduce them to our community. And they're caught up in the middle of a story that is another chapter in the book of Acts. And we have had the privilege of hearing pieces of that. We have about 10 minutes, and I know some of you want to ask questions or make comments. So the floor is yours in terms of the interaction. Ron, why don't you go ahead and start first?
Thank you very much, Mark and Boris and Terry. Our family live in Spokane, 2 children, 6 grandchildren, 1 great-grandchild. I subscribe to the Spokesman Review, so I saw last week the marvelous article about both of you and what you're doing. Question, though, one of the persons working for my son-in-law originally from Kazakhstan, early on was listening to Russian language broadcasts very much for the Russian side of this story. Is there tension within the Slavic community in terms of the war in Ukraine?
Boris, why don't you go ahead and take that?
Yeah, there's a little bit of tension, Ron. I would say the majority of people are on the Ukrainian side, right? In the churches, there's always conversation around peace. I think where it's really complex is there are a lot of Russian people from former Russian states who have been living here for 30 years. And now, they are seen as pro-Russian with these new folks coming in. And so I actually had a conversation this morning with a couple of key leaders about how to diffuse some of that. I think for the majority, I would say 85 to 90% people feel supported. There is that small section of the community, and you see it in the chats that are pro-Russian. And so that's really challenging. And we have to be careful of that too, but it is a minority opinion, I would say.
Thank you. Thank you for what you're doing.
Nancy Mackey put in the chat, how can we help? Is the best way to provide financial support to channel that through Thrive? Is that the best way to do that, guys?
Go, Mark.
Sorry, I was just typing an answer into the chat box, but
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of 3 things that I'm always telling folks about how to get involved. Certainly financial contributions are what's really helpful because they're so liquid. We can adjust to whatever needs exist. And if we've got funding, that gives us a lot of flexibility. But I also think it's really important to make sure that you can get involved personally in some way. Use the time you have or the relationships that you have so that you can make a connection. And I know most of you are there in Southern California. I'm not sure if there's others tuning in from other parts of the world, but there's Ukrainians in your backyard too. And there's agencies there that are also serving folks. And I'm sure there's Russian language Slavic churches in your community too. So figure out who those are. And, money helps and programs are good. But the thing that I keep finding as I interact with the folks who live in this hotel is the part that touches them the most is that people care. We had we've had so many neat acts of kindness and generosity. Like one small example, there's a CPA firm in town, and one of their staff was a refugee from Ukraine like 25 years ago. And as this whole war started happening, they started asking her like, well, what can we do to help your people? And then when they heard about Thrive, they're like, well, let's connect and see what we could do there. So they reached out and they were like, could we just make breakfast for all the people who live there? We're like, sure. So one Saturday, the CPA firm and all their staff brought in a big bunch of bacon and eggs and mashed potatoes and orange juice and just made breakfast and said, welcome to our community. And it's a small act. It's not super expensive. It takes a little bit of time, but it just means the world to somebody who came from the other side of the planet, doesn't know people here, and feels like, oh, you know what? We're not just a burden on this community. The folks who live here are excited to say welcome. We had a church that did a dinner similar to that. And by the end of the night, we had people sitting around tables. One of the guys who lives in the hotel plays guitar. So he got out his guitar and he started strumming away on some hymns. And the English-speaking folks recognized the tune. And so we had people sitting around tables who can't speak to each other, singing the same hymns in English and Russian at the same time. And I mean, that kind of personal connection is beautiful. And it's so inspiring for folks to know that they're welcome. So get involved personally somehow. The third piece I'd say is find ways to share the stories. You know, stories are what really changes people's hearts and minds and inspires all of us to act. So as you bump into a story that you like, you know, Ron, you talked about the Spokesman Review articles, circulate those around, share them with people, help other folks realize that this isn't just something that's happening far, far away, but it's something that's touching our community and that we can all be a part of.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, the Ukraine Relief Coalition still meets, and we met yesterday, and it was like there's so much support for Ukrainians here that we sort of forgotten about. The other goal that we started was to help Ukrainian churches that we're connected to in Spokane there, but the war is still happening, right? And so I put up a link. It's the Ukraine Relief Coalition. We still meet, and a lot of the funds we collect, we actually send overseas to those churches. And what's interesting is some of those churches, like one guy's wife and kid, he's like 17, they're in our church. The father went back and he serves about 4,000 meals a week to different people coming through his city, through his church. And we just started raising money to pay for a generator so they can run their kitchen, their soup shop or kitchen, right? Because the Russians are bombing infrastructure. So the URC, Thrive is doing a lot of stuff to help folks here. The URC now is really focused on two things. How do we help people get permanent status, but how do we keep supporting churches whose kids are in our church in Spokane while they fight the war and serve people there? So URC, anything you give there would go to those churches in Ukraine, which is just another way you can support. So thank you.
Well, thank you to all of you who have joined this very, very encouraging and challenging and inspiring conversation. And to my dear friends, Mark and Boris, you mean the world to me.
Thanks, Terry.
So thank you so much for your faithfulness to Christ and all that you're doing. And to my sisters and brothers here at Monte Vista Groves, we've walked this journey and continue to walk this journey because we've welcomed the Spock family to live here for a month before they were able to transition into their own apartment here in Pasadena. So Saturday is the 40th day since the grandfather in the family, Victor, passed away. Mm-hmm. So Suzette and I are going to go over there and be with them and hold vigil on the 40th day, which is in their tradition a very important day to say goodbye to this dear loved one. So I want to say thanks to all of us here at Monte Vista Groves for all that you have done and continue to do on behalf of the Spock family here in Pasadena. Well, next week we'll be turning our eyes and our ears primarily towards the joy of the Advent and Christmas season as we engage in music together. Again, Mark and Boris, thanks to you. And let me just close us in prayer. Lord, we long for the day when the prophetic vision that swords will be turned into pruning hooks comes, when there will be war no more, when the nations will gather around the throne and acknowledge the Lamb These visions strengthen our hearts, even in the midst of all the chaos and the tragedy, the violence and the death that we perpetrate upon each other. So, Lord, have mercy upon us, and we pray for courageous hearts and wise minds who can somehow negotiate an end to the ceaseless violence that is taking place in Ukraine. We pray for our brothers and sisters in Christ here in this country who have fled Ukraine, victimized by the violence, and our brothers and sisters in Ukraine who continue to carry on gospel work each day. Will you watch over them, protect them, keep them safe, and strengthen them, Lord, with great perseverance to be faithful to you as they care for others. We're grateful for your presence in our lives in Christ. Amen. Thank you, dear friends. And again, thanks to you, Mark, and to Boris. Really appreciate it.
So much for having me. Appreciate you guys.
We'll see you next week.